Bryan Hudson. Welcome to another edition of Justice Equals Righteousness Discussion Series. This is a program dedicated to understanding, to learning, to gaining perspective on important issues that relate to the work of the church and to community. We want to continue to explore the important and powerful concepts of justice as the Bible teaches them to us as believers, and as we practice that justice in terms of service to the world around us. This concept came to me working on my book, Biblical and Social Justice, What Is It? And I encourage you to check out the website for more information. I realized that in addition to writing a book, I wanted to engage with scholars and people who serve in our community, with pastors and really people just in our society who can help enlighten us on the important roles and practical roles that we can play as Christ followers in our society. My guest today is Malcolm D. Magee. Malcolm is a former pastor and devoted husband and father. He received his Ph.D. in history of international relations. His fields of interest include American religious history, progressive era politics, and 19th century political and religious thought. His book, What the World Should Be, Woodrow Wilson and the Crafting of a Faith-Based Foreign Policy, was released by Baylor University Press in 2008. Dr. Magee also authored a chapter on U.S. foreign policy since the colonial era for the Oxford Encyclopedia of American Religion. Malcolm has taught university students in Michigan. He's also taught in Prague, Czech Republic, and he's presently teaching history and philosophy at the University of Maryland Global Campus in Europe. And currently he's based in Italy. Malcolm's current academic writing can be found at these links I'm going to post on the page right now. Other writings are available on his author page at medium.com. So I want you to open your hearts and minds to a great discussion we're going to have. I want to welcome to our discussion Dr. Malcolm Magee. Welcome, Malcolm.
Well, thank you, Bryan. And I would recommend everybody read your book. It was a joy to read that manuscript and see the insights that you have there. And so I highly recommend the book. Anybody watching this, buy the book.
All right. Appreciate that. Now, I'm speaking with Malcolm from Italy, and he is situated north of Venice. Malcolm, what are you currently doing in Europe at this time?
Right. Well, I'm privileged to be teaching history and philosophy and government for the University of Maryland over here. The University of Maryland, ever since the Marshall Plan, has taught American troops and families on American bases over here. And so I'm a overseas collegiate professor teaching for the University of Maryland at various places in Europe. Currently, they have me in northern Italy, which is a nice place to be.
Let's get right into this because, wow, we've had lots of discussions. As a matter of fact, you know, we've been online. Of course, everybody's online because of COVID. Even before COVID, because of you know, where you were situated, whether in Michigan or now in Europe, you were in Prague. We haven't seen each other probably face to face, maybe 15 years. So yeah, this is great to have interaction with you, especially around issues which we have mutual concern. Specifically, the state of the church, the problems we're seeing and how Christians have attached themselves politically, and in our view, you know, have damaged credibility and hurt the cause of Christ. And so these are issues about which we have great concern. And I think about Dr. King talked about his great love motivated him. And I believe people sometimes miss the fact that in all that we say and we do and we kind of, sometimes we confront, it's in the spirit of love. You know, we actually, we love the church, we love the nation, and love makes you do strong things. So I know that love motivates you as well. So comment a bit about your motivation for being outspoken and for speaking into the situations we see around us?
Well, yeah, to start with, as a follower of Christ, we're commanded to love. And we're commanded to love everyone, but particularly the least of these, which means that anytime we see a system or a problem that is affecting a group of people, we have a responsibility, a love responsibility to do something about it. Also, Bryan, I got to be honest, Americans are about the most ignorant people concerning their actual history of any place that I've been. Czechs know their history. Germans know their history. Italians know their history. They tend to know our history better than the average American. And if we understood our history a little better, I think a lot of these issues would be cleaned up, or we would be able to deal with them more. So I think it's an issue of truth as well as love. And that's where we're stuck, speaking truth in love.
Well, that's why I had you come on. I mean, you're a professor of history, a Ph.D. professor of history. And so I really feel that this conversation is important. And I'm asking our listeners to pay attention, put your thinking caps on, and because I believe we're going to learn today from Dr. Magee. Let's start here, Malcolm. What parts of the founding of America need clarity in our times of Christian nationalism? First, define Christian nationalism, please. And what parts of our founding, our history of our founding, needs clarity? Right.
Well, first, Christian nationalism is the kind of Christianity that adds to the gospel something that's related to the nation itself. Instead of being a gospel for all nations, it becomes a gospel that's specific to a nation. One of the things that Dietrich Bonhoeffer fought against in Germany was the idea of German Christians, the idea that a German national church was going to be a deal. It's easier for us to look and say, oh, they're Nazis, they're bad, etc. It's a lot harder for Americans to see the degree to which we have equated the United States with God's chosen, the degree to which we have made assumptions about our system of government and our way of life being the Christian way of life, and the way we have ended up entwining those, that is dangerous. So that's Christian nationalism. And as you or anyone who's traveled the world knows, any gospel that doesn't fit everywhere is not the gospel. And an American evangelical Christian gospel, when you put those words together, it doesn't fit everywhere. You can't preach that in Italy. You can't preach that in China. You can't preach that in Nigeria. You can't preach that in Rwanda. It doesn't work. So therefore, we have to examine something in us and say, why did we get here? And how do we get back to a real gospel?
So key, so key. Now go ahead and delve into, let's talk history now, begin this discussion. So what parts of the founding of America need clarity in this time?
And this is where the angry comments will come.
Bring them. We're not fragile over here. We don't have, we don't have fragility over here. So yeah.
Yeah, the fact is, we grew up with an understanding of the United States that we got in kindergarten and grade school and high school, that when those of us who loved history decided, oh, we're going to go study this, and we opened up the actual documents, it was kind of I would call it the Great Disillusionment. Because the first thing that we discover is that the founders and the people who established our country were human beings. They weren't, the alabaster gods that we have on statues around. They were human beings, and they were flawed, just like everyone else. And I think if we can just get Christians to realize these are human beings, they're not the Apostle Paul, who was also a human being. I guess whatever. But we talk about the fact that the United States was founded to protect religious liberty. That's the number one thing we hear. They came here so that they could practice religion freely, which is true and untrue. The first people who came to this country came here to practice their religion freely and be intolerant of any other religion. So, for instance, the Pilgrims that we celebrate created colonies that would execute Quakers, banish Presbyterians, toss out anyone who didn't absolutely agree with them. They created colonies that had an intense religious intolerance. And with the exception of Pennsylvania, founded by the Quakers, and Rhode Island, founded by a guy who realized that pretty much he was the only guy saved, and therefore everybody could come in if he's going to have a colony, all of these colonies practiced fairly intolerant versions of their religion, and you were not a citizen of the colony unless you had that, which is why the founders separated church and state. They realized this country wouldn't hold together with these kinds of religious intolerances there. But those attitudes, those Puritan attitudes, those absolutist attitudes remain in the stream of American thinking, despite the fact that we created a constitution that wouldn't establish a state church. So that's one of the things that we have to think about. The second thing is the United States was founded at probably one of the least religious periods in our history. Some historic sociologists, last names Finke and Stark, did a famous study in which they figured that about 17% of people around the time of the founding of the United States actually went to church. So you're dealing with a population who, for one reason or another, is not attending church. Some of them because they weren't allowed in the churches of these colonies. Secondly, you're dealing with a population in which only a group of educated people at the top actually were putting together the ideas behind our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, etc. And these people were heavily influenced by a lot of European thinking that came from the Enlightenment. And they were Enlightenment thinkers who tended to be Christian deists, so they spoke in the Christian language, they used Christian words, but modern evangelicals project back on these people and on their language this idea that these were born-again, evangelical, devout Christian people. I'm not saying they weren't very serious about religion, because religion was an important issue at that time. But these were not born-again evangelical Christians. These were thinking Enlightenment, tolerant deists who were looking at ways of developing a relatively secular society that would allow people freedom of religion, a kind of freedom that didn't exist in some of the colonies. So that was the good. And we'll also come to the bad here in probably a little bit.
Yes, right. We romanticize our founding, and we hear people speak of the framers as godly and establishing Christian principle and all this. And so, but those of us who are African Americans, we can never not look at slavery. We can never not look at humans owning other humans. And in some cases, our ancestors, not all African Americans, of course, descended from slaves, but many of us did. And so it's impossible for us to ever look at history and not look at or think about or empathize with those, who were enslaved. And so that's why it's antithetical for us to hear the phrase founded as a Christian nation on biblical principles, unless slavery was to them a biblical principle, which I think we know it was to some.
Tom,
So let me ask you, why this almost said whitewashing, which is that's insensitive.
No, it's a
But why the
whitewash.
false narrative? What's the motivation behind not telling the history the way it happened? Because to me, the actual history is more interesting than the fabrications. So why has there been this miseducation with respect to our nation's founding?
Well, first off, the actual history is way more interesting. The whitewashed history is like a fairy tale. It's simplistic. It fits in a children's coloring book, and it is for children. Grown-ups need to grow up and recognize that this is a complicated history, and these people are good and bad, just like everybody. And sometimes they did good things and bad things in the same lifetime, these people. I think, first off, there is a desire to endorse the status quo. The people who benefit from the country as it is now are afraid of the honest truth about the founding, because it might mean we have to reconsider our history and consider changing some things. So they say, well, the United States was founded on Christian principles. And some of these Christians believe that slavery, for whatever reason, was a Christian principle. I don't think anybody that is of any substance today would say that. But in a sense, it was founded on Christian principles to the degree that the British Empire was founded on Christian principles. The French founded their nation on Christian principles. The Spanish Empire was on Christian principles. In fact, those nations actually had state churches, as did Russia. The czars, with all their brutality, had a state church, and the czars would personally be the head of the church. So these are all, quote, Christian nations. The fact is, the United States was the first republic to do some distancing from religion in the modern world. The rest of them didn't. And that was an Enlightenment idea. The Enlightenment, as you know, was this idea that somehow or other we are going to base our understanding on reason and science and the modern understandings that we're coming to, and not root them in some mythological or even superstitious brand of religion or Christianity. You hear what I'm saying? I'm not saying Christianity is superstitious, but there is a lot of superstition that rattles around within Christianity, and every Christian has encountered it at some point in some other believer. So there was a lot of that, and the Enlightenment was trying to get rid of all of that at once. So there we go.
Let me ask you then about the Enlightenment. Looking at history, we know that where we are today is the product of history, events of history, things that have happened that have shaped minds or shaped whole nations sometime. Let's talk about the Enlightenments. We hear this phrase, we talk about revivals, we hear about seminal events have shaped American Christianity. Let's go back, to, again, nation's founding or before the founding, and talk about these Enlightenments. You, when I asked you the questions and sent you the questions, you remarked upon, you talked about the Scottish Common Sense Enlightenment, for example.
Yeah.
You spoke of Enlightenment, late 1800s. So let's talk about the Enlightenments. First of all, what was an Enlightenment, and what Enlightenments have impacted our nation's founding and influenced our culture?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. And spending hours and hours trying to help young minds embrace this idea of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a period of time that people began to try to rely on reason instead of religion. And it begins and shapes what we would tend to call the modern period. And if we were to go on with philosophy, we would come to our current period and talk about the postmodern period and postmodern philosophers. But one of the keys in the Enlightenment is the ideas of people like Rene Descartes and Immanuel Kant, who wanted to find reasoned ways of living that would replace religion. Kant particularly wanted to create a moral ethic that would take the place of what was being lost as we tossed out religion. Immanuel Kant himself was an atheist. Now, our founders were influenced by a slightly different concoction. And bear in mind, a very small percentage of people were able to be involved in this because very few people were educated. Like we had an incredibly educated group of founding fathers, but the original group, even those who could vote when the country was put together, there's only about 15% of the population that could actually vote. You had to be a free man with property, which meant nearly no slaves could vote, women could not vote, Native Americans could not vote, white men and free black men without owning property could not vote. There were a very minuscule number of black men, insignificant to the point that we don't even count them in history, who could actually vote in early America. But it represented at the time the educated elites. Now, without boring your listeners, I'll just say this. To make it very simple, Descartes and Kant talk about reason. The Scots had a guy by the name of David Hume who is saying, we are not rational people, we are feeling people, and the only thing that matters is how we feel. We sense things. John Locke talks about we are born with nothing in our heads, and we therefore have to learn everything. So Locke and Hume stand apart from Descartes and Kant, who say we're born as rational people. Everything we need is in our heads, so we just need to learn to reason properly. Scottish common sense tried to find, in a sense, a middle ground between these two, which was we're going to be skeptical of things like Hume and Locke. We're also going to try to use our minds as much as we can, but we're going to be fairly skeptical and just live with what we can prove. Now, this is very compatible with deism, and these are Christians. John Witherspoon, the only minister to sign both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, who trained James Madison and others, was a Scottish common sense Enlightenment Presbyterian minister. This idea precluded speaking to you by the Holy Spirit, speaking to us, miracles, the phenomena that, say, a modern charismatic evangelical would take as part of their faith. These don't exist with these people. So the Christians of the time and the deists of the time actually held a lot of common views about the world, about God, about nature, about the importance of reason. So that's one thing. The second Enlightenment is that the United States goes through a period of several different great awakenings, Christian revivals. So along with the fact that the educated elites are being influenced by Enlightenment ideas, even people like Jonathan Edwards are very prone to these ideas. That's what the educated people do, still do to a degree. Education trains you to analyze, scrutinize, think about what you can prove to be true, and step back and be a little cautious about asserting, I know something, when you don't have evidence for it. But the Great Awakenings were big revivals that swept the country. The first one in the 1740s precluded the revolution. It obviously died out reasonably quickly. Well, maybe not. Maybe these people weren't just attending churches, but there was a small church attendance. The next Great Awakenings the Second Great Awakening that takes place, it does something even more substantial on the topic we are dealing with today, which is institutional racism. And that is that revival, as it began to spread across the country, caused people, common working people, to come to Christ, and African slaves began to come to Christ. And that threw a real conundrum to Southern slave owners. The Quakers had always been opposed to slavery in most ways. Northern churches tended to oppose slavery, but these churches were across the North and the South. Southern churches, some Southern preachers were also against slavery. I mean, there was abolitionists in the South prior to the Civil War. We forget that there were people who were opposed to slavery who lived in the slave-owning South, and in some ways they're the least known about and probably the bravest. It's fine to be an abolitionist in Boston, but being an abolitionist in Montgomery, Alabama, that takes some guts. Anyway, so as this revival goes by, it does something with the people. And it's something that creates a big problem for Southern slave owners. They feared the Christian message of equality. We're all brothers and sisters in Christ. If they were going to have brothers and sisters in Christ, that puts a little problem with the issue of slavery. Because how can I own a brother or a sister in Christ? And so they ended up, by the time of the Civil War, you ended up with these denominations splitting apart. In the North, they became more and more adamant about ending slavery. Ideas about women's rights also started creeping in. And in the South, they had to become more and more, do all sorts of theological gyrations to justify slavery. And they ended up breaking up. You had the Southern Baptist Church forming as opposed to Northern Baptists. You had the Presbyterian Church in the Confederacy, which becomes the Southern Presbyterian Church for a while and then, merges into something later. And the Methodists, who as a denomination tended to oppose slavery, formed the African Methodist Episcopal Church in the South. In other words, the churches began to have to break up because the revivals were throwing light on the inconsistencies between what the Bible said and how they lived. And it made it very uncomfortable, kind of like where we are now.
Now, you see, that's fascinating. That and encouraging to know that the awakenings did awaken a sense of God's justice, and that there began to be, as you remarked in one of your notes you sent to me, it was impossible now to overlook the injustice of slavery. And yet there was a resistance, right, to giving it up. We know for economic reasons above all. But you also mentioned in notes that taking Thomas Jefferson as an example of the problem then and maybe somewhat now, that Jefferson called slavery an abominable crime, but he owned slaves. And never gave them up. So what is this where people are aware that something is wrong, but they won't let it go?
Right.
And it's like we see that today. As we speak and record, we've had an election in which Joseph Biden won, Donald Trump lost, but Donald Trump would not concede or even admit he lost. And he has followers galvanized around that lie. What is it? Now, this may be more of a psychological question, but what is it? Here it is. What is it in religious Christianity that allows people to say something is wrong, but not change? But not to see injustice, but not address it. What do you think is behind that? Right.
Well, addressing that, I mean, Jefferson is an interesting character. He wasn't, you use him as our Christian example, obviously.
Right, for sure.
But Jefferson, he applauded the French when they eliminated slavery in the French Revolution, although Napoleon brought it back, at least in the colonies. Jefferson is an interesting guy in that I think at the time of the founding, it was assumed slavery was slowly, steadily dying out. There's a question mark as to whether or not the slave society was actually profitable. Jefferson went bankrupt twice. It was easy to look profitable when you have people bringing you mint juleps on the porch, and you have servants all around. But in fact, the plantation systems were not the most well-run businesses. But when it comes to Christians, I think there's something even more going on than certainly went on with Jefferson. With Jefferson, it was like, okay, I have 3 goals. I have all these goals. Eliminating slavery is way down the list. I think it's an abomination. I think it's evil. But getting independence and somehow finding a way to hold these colonies together to make us a nation is a bigger deal right now than me picking this fight. And it's, and it wasn't, Jefferson is not picking that fight. For Christians, think about this. We judge a person's Christianity not by how they believe. Do they believe in an action that is loving and kind and gracious to their neighbor and generous and reflecting Jesus? Or are they a Christian because of what they believe? So I specifically had a born-again experience. I believe a specific thing about John 3:16. Therefore, what I believe makes me a Christian. Whereas in other Christian traditions, they look at what is Christianity by how you live. Does that person's life reflect the love and grace of God? And they're less worried about the specifics of their doctrinal purity. Americans can say, oh, this is wrong. I believe it's wrong. Therefore, like my salvation, I'm believing the right thing. It doesn't matter what I do, or what I do is of secondary importance because I'm holding the right belief. I can go to sleep with a clear conscience because I believe this is wrong. And once you cross that Rubicon in your mind that you are not believing it while people are still suffering under an evil institution, you have gone beyond the boundaries of private personal salvation, and you have started encroaching on the areas of social injustice in the world around us. And you've started engaging in this idea of the kingdom of God coming on earth as it is in heaven. And it is troublemaking. It is disruptive. It is going to cause you to collide with friends, as we have discovered in these last 4 years, those of us who lost people that we thought were friends. And there's something about the pietistic American evangelical that just wants to privately hold the right belief, but be polite to all of their friends who are not doing anything about it. We simultaneously believe the American experiment is God's people, a Christian nation, and gloss over it with this fake past. And at the same time, by doing that, we feel we can get away with not trying to alter or change it when people point out that it is flawed. Instead, we like to point out, no, it's not flawed. This was God's chosen thing. I personally think this is wrong, but it's just 1 or 2 bad people. So long as I can believe it's just 1 or 2 bad apples, I can get away with just believing it's wrong. Once I realize there's a system that needs changing, there's a history of this that we need to reckon with and deal with, I'm going to be a troublemaker.
I believe this past 4 years with President Trump, the data that in 2016 and 2020, 80% of white evangelicals supported President Trump for president and for re-election, respectively. And that number, 80%, stands out. It's so far above everybody else. The general Christians in the country, from what I read, Pew Research data, and I'll pull it up here on the screen in a moment, it was nowhere near that 80-20 split,
No.
right? And of course, African Americans, we're totally opposite. We're like 90%. And the thing is, African Americans are socially conservative.
Right.
We're not down with abortion. We believe in traditional marriage. And so we are very conservative on social things. And yet we got our Christian brothers and sisters who are diametrically opposed to us.
Right. Yeah.
It is a conundrum. And then when I talk to many of those evangelicals who are in that 80%, I see it clearly. And I see the silence, on institutional racism, and I see, I hear them dance, or I see them kind of dance around issues and just hide, it's just, and it's become pathetic,
right.
Especially in light of, as you said, we have had friends that have gone that way. Now, I take friendship very seriously. I'm very loyal. The Bible says a friend loves at all times.
Right.
And yet I found that in this environment, I've had friends who haven't loved at all times. I had friends who have said things, written things that they had to know would offend me and would contradict what I've held for a long time, not just since Donald Trump became president. And then why would somebody who knows me say or do something that is opposed to my culture, my history? And I realized, wow, these are not your friends. They're acquaintances, and they're people who maybe need a black person in their life. I don't know what it is.
They do.
So it is a point of heartbreak and disappointment. I guard against bitterness. That's important too. Not to be bitter about the thing. But my stance, Malcolm, has been, okay, well, here we are. Let's see what God has in this for us. And I believe what God is doing partly is letting us see who is who, what is what.
Right.
People say, well, we have to unify. No, we don't. Not at all costs. Scripture says,
what unity can you have with a Klan leader right now?
Can't do it. I'm not going to do that. And in fact, Dr. King famously said, call me maladjusted. I'm saying, I can't align myself with this. So my point is, what we're doing in this conversation here and in our life, in our work, is we're seeking to educate and enlighten people in hopes that maybe the next generation will get it right. I'm not sure about this current generation. I'm not sure if we can salvage some of these folk, man. It's incredible. So let me back up and ask you the next question. I'm kind of going off the rail a little bit, but I'm preaching, so I'll stop preaching and ask the next question. Now, let's talk about racism. What can we do about racism? I asked you that question in the notes I sent you. It's a tough question. I guess to start out with, what is racism and what can we do about that? That's a big topic, to land on your lap just now. But I'm going to ask you, what is racism? What can we do about it?
One of the joys of not being a pastor anymore, being a historian, is I only have to deal with dead people. They can't talk back, and history is what it is. But when we talk about this, these are modern, current pastoral concerns but they're concerns that we should all have. I'll have to be honest. I found myself going through an incredibly bitter disillusionment about my fellow white evangelicals, to the point that I don't use the term evangelical anymore. I just can't. It just is too loaded. It's not worth doing anymore. But and I held out some hope when I saw, well, it's 80% of the white evangelicals who voted. A bunch of them stayed home, so maybe they aren't in that. I don't know. It's ridiculously high. And they stayed loyal right to the end. Now, I know a lot of personal friends who voted for Trump who were adamantly opposed to him by the time he was done, and they were opposed to him because of the racial issues. And so I do know some white believers who've come around. But the issue of making a change is the issue. And I struggle with hopelessness for my generation. So therefore, I look at the young ones that are coming on. First off, you have to recognize that there is a system of racial injustice. Until you honestly accept that, you're not going to do anything. And it is there. The data is there. Anybody who's willing to do the research will find it's there. Secondly, you have to recognize that all of us have racist problems in us. We cannot help it. I was born in the whitest part of America by two, obviously, white parents. I mean, I don't think I probably need to explain that if anybody's watching this. The first black man I ever met was my cousin Rosie got engaged to Mike, and she brought Mike home. So, I mean, and we were Quakers. So, I mean, I guess it probably helped that my first introduction to a black man was my soon-to-be cousin. But nonetheless, I had zero knowledge. I mean, that's the first thing. Unless you have good friends in a group, and I mean good friends, the kinds that talk to you honestly, and unless you are curious about how it feels to be someone else, you don't know. So the first thing I had to do as I aged was recognize that I was a racist. I didn't try to be a racist. I didn't want to be a racist. I didn't choose to be a racist. But how could I not be with the lack of knowledge I had? To me, the status quo was just fine, right? I didn't live in inner city Detroit. I didn't live in Selma, Alabama in the 60s. I didn't go through these experiences. I didn't know about them. So the first part is to recognize that we have racial institutions and educate yourself about your own issues, and be humble enough to recognize that being a racist doesn't mean you're a bad person. It's just something you have to educate yourself about and deal with. And I think a lot of times when you talk about racism, people immediately, they jump, it's Bull Connor. Oh, I'm not Bull Connor. I'm not, sicking dogs on little children and fire hosing them, people trying to pray in the park. I'm not a racist. And I think once you take the stigma out of it a little bit and say, hey, everybody has their biases. Secondly, somebody says, well, we have to deal with black racism too. When black people are the dominant culture and running the institutions and the businesses and the government and the legal structure, yeah, perhaps. But racism, and I have, I've worked with black folks that didn't like me just because I was white. But you know what? That didn't hurt me. Whereas white racism to black people in a system that's biased against black people or Latinos in some places hurts. It hurts with education. It hurts with access to loans for jobs. It hurts with access to employment. It hurts all the way around. So the racism that matters in America is white racism, period. Anything else is simply an inconvenience or a problem for one or two people. And if you want to talk about a kind of racism that really does reflect the individual, African-American racism to white people, which I also, thinking about history, think is earned. I'm not saying it's right, but I'm saying I can see, if I were a black man in Alabama, why particularly a big black man who is going to face even more racism than a diminutive, smaller, less harmful looking black person, I would feel a resentment to white people too. So once you can empathize and think about it, and once you can see the institutions that exist, we got a problem. So the other thing is, we can't just think that we pass a law and fix something, Bryan. We like to do that in America. Oh, we're going to fix it. We're going to pass a law. We think we have a drinking problem in America. We'll pass prohibition. No more alcohol, right? That's why nobody at all drank through the 20s. The 1920s was the driest period in American history. No one ever got drunk in the 20s.
Yeah, yes, they did. They rolled their own, as we say. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, exactly. We have to do the daily work of educating our young, and I'm hopeful our younger people are way different about these issues than your and my generation. They're way more savvy on this sort of thing, and they're going to be in power one of these days. Hopefully they will make a change, but we can help them. We have the experience to show them where the institutions need changing. Do you want me to? I got one other more controversial point.
Yeah, let me get to that about how we can handle it. I want to affirm what you just said, because I want listeners to understand that what Malcolm is saying here represents a self-awareness that is so absent, in many of us, white and black Americans, of course, white folks more in the area of racism, and that with any problem we want to solve, there's always the starting point is recognition. Even, the person who's drinking and to excess has to say, you know what, I'm an alcoholic. I need help.
Right.
And so there is no solution without recognition of the problem. And that's what I believe that sometimes evangelicals and Christians struggle with, because they're faith-based. And so their faith says, I'm good, I'm healed, I'm blessed. and so how can I be racist? And the thing is, but as you said, racism isn't always the overt hatred and the plotting against others. It is sometimes just a product of outcome of how one was trained. For example, I talked about in a previous conversation, white nationalism. You define Christian nationalism, but white nationalism is that belief the nation should look like us, reflect our values, our customs, and so forth. And without realizing it, a person can be raised thinking the country should look just like this, just like us, and that is a form of racism. It's not the violent form of racism, but it's racism. And so that when we look at the nation, which even it says e pluribus unum, out of many one, it didn't say out of one, out of many one, that one doesn't have to look like what I think it should look like. Now, to be fair, there's black nationalism, like there's, black racism, as you well said, but it's more of a nuisance. I mean, black racism is just a nuisance, nothing more. White racism is devastating. It's devastating. So that's why I want our listeners and viewers to understand, we know these are problems. Anybody who hates somebody that's bad, it's wrong. It's just that the black person's racism will not be a problem for you, right?
Right.
It's a problem for him. It's a problem with God. But yet, when we have 25% of the population, well, less than that, I think now, 13%, I think, is our share of the population in African Americans, 13%, I believe is right, between there and 20%. Anyway, but we just, we're minorities racially. So it's good that people like yourself and many others are self-aware to the point of realizing, even though you're in Europe now, you're still an American, you're expatriate, you love the nation still, we have to work on these issues. And as you also suggest, we got to go and educate these young folk now. Because these old people, man, I haven't given up totally on them, but the hope of the future is with the young people now. So let's talk now about, you suggest some solutions to addressing racism and what we can do from a public policy perspective. What can we do? Now, let's stipulate, you cannot stop a person from being racist.
No.
That's a hard issue. How can we mitigate the effects of racism?
Yeah. And people say, well, people will use that it's a hard issue to try to get you to not deal with the institution. But the fact is, we dealt with the institution of slavery by law. We dealt with the institution of voter suppression in 64 and 65 and Jim Crow in 64 and 65 by law. We didn't wait for Bull Connor's heart to change. Or George Wallace. Wallace eventually did change at the end of his life. He got reelected with the African-American vote in Alabama, which if you considered that in 1965, you just said, that was you would never have believed that.
And to that point, hold that thought, African Americans are people, we are forgiving people, we always have been. Matter of fact, if you get in trouble, find some black people.
Yeah.
They take care of it, you know what I'm saying? Yeah, so to your point, we're not against, we actually know as a people generally that when someone expresses a desire to change, by all means, receive them. Don't hold a grudge.
Yeah, but we've changed the law and the system before Wallace changed his heart.
That's good.
Yeah. So the fact is, we have to do something systemic. One of the things, of course, is education. I'll start with the easy ones. We need to just make sure that we have proper education, proper history. The Republican school boards, and I'm saying Republican because that's predominantly who does this, like to keep a standard type of history going. But the fact is, we have to have an honest history, age appropriate. Kindergartners just get, cut out turkeys and Pilgrims and Squanto and, okay. I understand children need a different kind of history than middle schoolers or high schoolers. But by the time you leave high school, you should have an honest adult history of the United States. And I think it will take recruiting white people to talk to white people. For me to say, listen, I was a racist. I wasn't a bad person. I didn't see myself as a bad person. I didn't hate people. I didn't do anything bad. So you can be a good person and a racist. You can be a good person and an alcoholic. You can be a good person and have other struggles. We know that. We don't. Part of it is our religious view is got this perfectionist thing. You have to be this alabaster saint all the time. And we don't therefore deal with people who are good people who are struggling with other issues. Now, once you take that out and say you're not Bull Connor, I'm not saying you're Bull Connor, but let's sit down and educate you as a white person as to how this system benefits you in a way that it doesn't benefit your black brothers or your Latino brothers and sisters in the same way it benefits you. And let's imagine, if we can, how we can create a system in which it wouldn't matter what the color of your skin or the background of your family was, you would indeed all have an equal mercy and an equal justice. So there's a philosopher, John Rawls. I use that with my students at the end of a philosophy class to talk about this issue of racism. He has people imagine you are not in the world yet and you're about to get a lottery and you could be born anywhere. You don't know. You could be born to the child of a well-paid orthodontist in Scottsdale, Arizona, or you could be born to the mother of a crack addict, or a mother who's a crack addict in Detroit. And you don't know where you're going to go. How would you want the world to be different so that it wouldn't matter where this lottery ran to you, where you ended up? That's how you begin to imagine a just world, is imagine, would you want to be anywhere else, or if you were arbitrarily put somewhere else? Okay, that's a thought experiment that's off the topic. But
very intriguing, though. I mean, we have to have, that's a good thought, Malcolm, because we have to philosophically frame what we think needs to happen. And that was a great way of doing that. So please, don't apologize. Continue.
Yeah. Well, Rawls was fascinating. I like him. But here's the deal. We passed a law. It's not done yet. There's work to be done. So a law was passed into the Civil War, 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment. All these people who have been in slavery for a century and a half, 2 centuries, are free. Abolitionists in the North, yay, we won. God bless them. They won. Now what?
Yes.
No property, no money, no education, no home to live in. All the money and labor and toil that they had done went to someone else. And those people got to keep it. They didn't get 40 acres and a mule. If we'd done the right thing then, we might be dealing with something far less now. But there's so many other complications, it probably would still have been an issue. Okay. Jim Crow South, we eliminate segregation. Well, legal segregation.
Right.
We did. We haven't actually eliminated it. We supposedly deal with voting rights. We haven't quite done that either. The laws are passed, but there's still work to do because we have to do these things every day. Now, poverty is generational, and racial poverty has come down to us from multiple generations and the ongoing systemic racism that has led to this. When we have 5 to 10 times the number of black men in prison as white, depending on the state, there is a problem. You can tell there's something going on in the courts that is more prone to convict black men than white men, more prone to convict Latinos than white men, more prone to convict black men than Latinos. We know this. It's there. Yeah. Black people don't commit more crimes than white people. They commit different crimes because crimes are a matter of proximity. So there are more white-collar white people crimes, and they get a slap on the wrist. That's the white-collar crime is the equivalent of walking to a liquor store and robbing it. That's their crime of proximity. All right. What do we do about it? First off, I'm not opposed to affirmative action or reparations. Those are scary words for white people. And that's where immediately everybody calls me a communist. But at some point, we have such powerful wealth inequality, and poverty has been so systemic and so generational. And it goes back to a time where we know it began, and we watched black people be robbed of their opportunities and property over and over and over. And okay, even if we think that starting in 1968, these things were legally fixed, we were alive in 1968. We there are still generations yet to come that need to fix this, and we owe our fellow citizens their fair share. Okay, that's a hard sell. It's a hard sell to say we have a minority of 15 to 20% in this country that you are all going to kick in your tax dollars or something and give them money to the average white person for something that happened 150 years ago that they had nothing to do with. That's how it resonates with them.
Let me
I'm
address
in favor of it.
that moment. Yeah, that's you're right. It's a hard sell. Theoretically, it's totally correct. Theoretically,
Yes.
It's just practically, it's hard to do. Matter of fact, let me share this, and this is in my book. I did some research on this, and some two black professors did a calculation, and Williamson and Kane did a calculation about the economic magnitude of slavery and the free labor, for the time that
Right.
slaves were producing, all the wealth at that time. And so they did a calculation, and it's an astounding number. It almost doesn't seem possible, but in 2016 value, or dollars, the the estimate of the value of the slave labor and all that came from 1880 was $14 trillion.
Yeah.
And right. So it's like I think the problem is reparations is a problem because you may as well give us the whole nation, just hand the keys over. Which it's a hard sell. It is, but here's what I hope could happen, Malcolm. Really, honestly, I'll expect reparations to happen, not because it shouldn't, because it won't, for obvious reasons. And by the way, when the slave masters lost their plantations, they got paid for losing slaves. They got reparations for having to give up the slaves. Quick story: I had a person one time sue me over something pretty frivolous, and so my attorney, he handled it, and we countersued, and we won. He lost his case, we won our case, and I was in a position to take a lot from him, but I didn't want anything from him. I want to send a message. Don't go around doing stupid things, like trying to hurt people you can't hurt. And I think, if even we had a national, some sort of at least just acknowledgement that here is the amount of wealth African-American ancestors contributed to the nation. I mean, we actually physically built buildings in D.C. and all that.
Sure.
Just to say, man, we can't afford to pay y'all fully, but we can do these policies. And honestly, some things have been done.
Yeah.
But my point is, if there was just an acknowledgement of what was taken, of the abuse, of the exploitation, man, that would satisfy us. Reparations, as far as the practical matter of implementing it, cash-wise is kind of a non-starter, but policy-wise, things can be done. So go ahead and finish. You have some other thoughts about what can happen policy-wise, to make things better. Mm-hmm.
They're probably as big a non-starters too. I mean, the bottom line is something needs to be done. Reparations is the right thing to do. Maybe we need a South African style Truth and Reconciliation Committee where we acknowledge the sin, because people talk about reconciliation, but until you deal with the system and acknowledge the sin, it's hard to reconcile. I mean, you've done something, someone's done something wrong to me. I can forgive them for my sake, detach and move on. But reconciliation requires an acknowledgement of the wrong somehow that we can make it right. But of late, I've been reading some ideas that might fix the problem. So one of the problems about reparations that are justly deserved by poor Black people in this country is you got a lot of dirt poor white Appalachian people, dirt poor white folks living in trailers around this country who have also generational poverty. And I know some of those folks. And I can just imagine how, and they vote and they're angry and they are, I can imagine how it would feel to them to have one group of poor people get helped and not them. And I think when Dr. King began his Poor People's Campaign, one of the things he realized is we have two tracks running in this country at the same time. One is institutional racism, and the other is an institutional class system that keeps the rich rich and the poor poor. They are both systemic problems, and they are both there. Now, it just happens that the systemic class issue affects far more African American citizens than it does percentage-wise than it does white Americans. And I think what Dr. King was looking at was if you find a way to resolve the poverty issue at the bottom of the issue, the thing, you do two things. You give poor Blacks and poor whites an alliance. They are together in this thing, and recognize that wealthy people, it's in their interests to keep Blacks and Hispanics and whites in the poverty realm fighting each other, squabbling over the crumbs, because if they were to unite together behind an FDR type candidate or somebody like that, they would vote their guys out of office in a heartbeat, because there's a lot more poor people than there are rich people. That's why they call the rich people the 1%. The poor have a lot more votes. And what they do is they keep them squabbling with each other all the time. And race is one of the ways that they do that. And that is just the facts. Whether it's a conspiracy or just the way it works out, I don't know. I tend to I tend to not embrace conspiracy theories because they tend to be way out. Oh. But it looks like one. I can say it looks like a conspiracy, even if it's not. The Bible gives Israel an answer, and it's an answer that has been looked at seriously by economics, and that is abolish the debt. Abolish everyone's debt at once. It would serve to at least partly deal with the reparations issue. It would serve to deal with the generational poverty of white people. It would be egalitarian. And the key for this is in the past, when issues have been done to help folks, paying plantation owners for lost property, that only affected plantation owners. Farm relief, that doesn't help sharecroppers. The GI Bill didn't help Black folks. What you have to do is do something that helps everyone, and in a sense, hit a restart button. Mm-hmm. And I thought to myself, this is a crazy, crazy idea. So I just started doing some research on it. It's a crazy idea that a whole lot of people are looking at, and they're saying, for the great wealth stratification we have in this country right now, the quickest, easiest fix is a one-time, complete, across the board debt elimination. The Jubilee, it's right out of Deuteronomy. It's right out of the Bible. It's right out of, now I'd like to see white evangelicals getting all upset that we're going to do something right out of the Bible. Now that will be the fun point. when you have these agnostic Marxists saying, "Oh, but it's here in the Bible. We're just trying to do biblical things here."
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because that's another problem we see is people talk about the Bible and the kingdom of God, and yet when it comes to benefiting somebody else, they have a hard time seeing it. They see clearly everything that benefits themselves. In my view, the most important thing we can do is offer people a technical and/or education in college.
Mm-hmm.
If we can fund people going to technical school and going to college, that's where I like to start, because, man, college is way too expensive. I mean, there are expenses running a school. I know that. And yet, I know now in Europe, I know, for example, you can go to school in Europe. Is that correct? You can go to school in Europe?
Most of the countries over here, you just go.
Yeah.
You have to do well. If you don't do well, you get shuffled over. But whether it's a trade school or college, they sort of find out what you have an aptitude to, and then you do it.
Well, that's my thought is reparations starting at some place that we can really totally do,
Yeah.
Because I'm pragmatic. As much as I want things to happen, the pragmatic side says that's going to take, well, we should work on it. If it takes 20 years, work on it. But what can we do that we can get done in a year, 2 years,
Well, we've already done that with one group. Native Americans can go to college for free.
Okay.
We've recognized we screwed them out of land and people and, slaughtered 90% of them in first 100 years.
Yeah.
Well, disease and whatever else. And so most states have Native American college funds. If you're a Native American descendant, you can go. Now, so we could easily do that. Now, that's going to still cause poor white Appalachian families to get a level of resentment. But I think I have to tell people there's no perfect situation. You clear off all debt. There's some people who are going to go back into debt. If they ever did it in the Old Testament, we don't know. We know that God said to do it. It gave everybody a fresh chance every 50 years. And then those people could use that chance to go up or use that chance to go down again.
Right.
If they went down, their grandchildren 50 years away were going to get another chance to get out of that. But the fact is, whatever we do, whether it's reparations, free college, debt forgiveness, there's always going to be someone who abuses it, but that doesn't mean it's the wrong thing to do. I can show grace and love and generosity and forgiveness to a person who abuses that, but it's still the right thing to do. So I think we just have to look at, say, if we do the right thing, we'll get maybe as good a society as we can. There will still be individuals who will behave in a racially biased manner. There will still be problems. There will still be eventually some forms of poverty. There will still be a lot of things. But to say that it's going to be abused is not a reason not to do it if it's the right thing to do.
I agree. Yeah, no, we see that true with everything else we do. So I agree with that. And also, to the issue of poor whites, obviously we should help everybody. I think you made a point in your notes that if you help everybody, then you proportionally help those who need it more, right? So the idea is help everybody, but the proportional aspect pays attention to those who need more help, right? So I get that. Yeah, that's so true.
Because of institutional racism, a far greater percentage of Black families are in poverty than white families.
Right.
So you might end up helping the bottom 8% of white families and the bottom 40% of Black families. So it would be, and I think that's what Dr. King, as I understood the writings, why he got involved in the Poor People's Campaign, which everybody told him not to do, was that, hey, this is kind of as close to a silver bullet as we can get. And it disproportionately, in a good way, helps our people while not excluding poor Latinos and poor whites. And it has a unifying message. We're helping all of us to get out of poverty.
Yes.
But you're right. We got to couple it with education. We got to couple it with other things. We got to couple it with, it's not by itself the silver bullet, but boy, it would sure give us a window of time in which we could do these things.
Yes, so true. Something else
Bryan,
I'll add
I'm
to that
so
as
happy
well.
I'm happy for what you're doing. This entire thing that you're doing is absolutely wonderful. I am
I
thrilled
appreciate that. No, it's necessary work, and a lot of us, I mean, African American males and ministers, we're on this really since last spring. We've done it all of our lives, but it's intensified, realizing that we have a voice, we're going to use it. Now, and back to the point about institutional racism, it isn't only, of course, poverty is one outcome, one bad outcome of it. Another bad outcome is opportunity, lack of opportunity. And the case in point is, I'm a pastor. Also, I do production work. I have a company, been producing for a long time, video production and things like this. And to this day, okay, with all my experience, I still have to send my work ahead of me before I let you see my face.
Right.
I don't let people see my face before they see my work. See, because I know what's going to happen, right? They'll see my face, middle-aged black guy, overweight, What could he know about digital media, right? That assumption.
Well, first, a lot more than I know about it.
And so they see my work and like, call that guy, you know what I'm saying? So now that's an aspect of institutional racism or systemic racism that is very, very difficult to put a finger on, right? Because poverty is pretty clear, but the opportunities that are denied because of race is another big problem that we look at. So hence affirmative action, the spirit of it, is pay attention to every qualified person, especially those who don't look like you. Right. And the wrong ideal that affirmative action is going to put an unqualified person ahead of a qualified person, kind of hurt the whole cause, right? Because that was the misnomer.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, Doc, our time is come and gone. We might have another conversation. There's so many issues I want to talk about. We covered most items for today, but there's so much more I'd like to talk to you about. Perhaps we can talk in the future. Now, on the screen, for our listeners and viewers, and also for those that are listening to the podcast, I have put in the notes and descriptions some of the writings of Dr. Magee. He has books out. He has scholarly books he's written that have been used in college instruction. So look at those links, please. He has a medium.com blog where he's posted some amazing articles. In fact, one article I'll mention now, Malcolm wrote an article called The Dark Side of Religion in America. One of the conclusions he comes to, and I'll read this quote here, it says, if the church is to be truly universal, then it needs to remain both welcoming to all sides of the political debate and potentially confrontational to all sides. The church must also acknowledge the right of other religions and non-believers to live in harmony in a harmonious civil society. If the church does not, it will become loathsome to all, just another institution of accrued power. Well, man, we become loathsome. The loathsome piece has come to pass because the church at large has not been confrontational to all sides. And worse is, as you say here, become another institution of accrued power. And so there's work to do, and we're doing it. We'll keep speaking out. And so before we close out today, any final remarks you want to share with the audience?
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Bryan. I would say, we talk about your very potent statement about having to send your work before they see you. I think we talk about the church, and people like to say, oh, the government should get out of the business of helping the poor. That should be the church's business. Well, the church doesn't have enough money and isn't big enough to help deal with all the poor in this country.
Right.
What the church can do is work at changing the attitudes that you describe you face when you do your work. Our job should be working as instruments of grace and reconciliation in our society, helping people to love their neighbor, whether they're a believer, whether they're a Muslim, whether they're a Hindu, whether they're a fellow Christian. Sometimes loving fellow Christians is harder.
Oh, man.
But the fact is, if we would go out and teach and speak and preach that we need to get beyond the facial color, the cultural background, and look at the content of people's character and really do a good job at that, that is a role of the church. And I think the church can do a really good job there. So there's lots of things I don't think the church alone is big enough to do. We have to do things as fellow citizens with people outside the church. But there are some things like this that I think the church is specifically designed and equipped to do.
Absolutely. Yeah, we can benefit from public-private partnerships. You know, we've done that for years. In our church, we receive grants from private institutions. We work with the government, local government, and some things. And so it's possible to work together to help people, you know, no doubt about it. Well, I've been speaking with Dr. Malcolm Magee. I want to thank you for coming in all the way from north of Venice, Italy. And I couldn't pronounce the name of your city, so you gave me a good way to avoid having to say the name of the city. But where are you located again, the name of that city? Say that.
I live in Pordenone, just between Venice and Aviano.
We all know where that is, right? Well, again, thank you so much. Thank you for your work. I mean, you've been a pastor, and now you're an educator of some esteem, and for sure. And I appreciate your work in the academy, and also your work in the community. So thank you so much, Malcolm. And God bless you and Judy out there in Italy. I hope to come see you one day when they allow Americans to go somewhere. Right now, we can't go anywhere. Nobody wants us now. Yeah. So I hope to come visit you at some point.
Some really good food over here, man.
Yeah, that's what I need, more food. Thank you, Malcolm. God bless. We'll be in touch. Justice equals righteousness. Welcome, friends. This is Bryan Hudson. I want to introduce to you my new book entitled Biblical and Social Justice, What Is It? An Everyday Person's Guide to Understanding Justice and the Role of the Church in Our Society. I want to invite you to get your copy of the book in print or Kindle format, also in Apple iBook format. We also have a digital voice format as well. All available at the website at biblicaljusticebook.com. We're living at a crossroads spiritually, socially, politically, and interrelationally. We are all aware of injustice in our nation. The murder of George Floyd by a police officer brought injustice to our nation in a light that is both tragic and shocking. We also know that most injustice occurs in less obvious systemic ways. In my book, I discuss justice at three levels. First, there is biblical justice, which is essentially God's righteousness and order within us as His people. In the Bible, the Hebrew and Greek words justice and righteousness are closely related, and in many cases, the two words are identical. Righteousness begins with God, therefore, justice begins with Him also. Biblical justice is not the demands placed on others who are not Christ followers. It is what we live through the grace of God. Second, there's social justice, which in my understanding is the outworking of justice and righteousness to the world around us. The prophet Isaiah said, by the inspiration of the Lord, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the cause of the widow. That would be social justice. When we learn to do what's right, which is biblical justice and righteousness within God, then we're able to seek justice for others, defend the oppressed, and take up the cause of those in need. Third, there is civil justice, which addresses public policy, jurisprudence, and equal treatment of people under the law. In the areas of biblical and social justice, the book addresses core issues to many of the problems we face today and offers solutions through practical wisdom, working together, and operating and learning how to live through the Word of God. Among the issues that we face are miseducation, false narratives about our history as a nation and African American people. We all know the necessity of properly understanding a problem before we can fix it. Issues such as miseducation, white supremacy, and the treatment of racial minorities has roots in bad theology, poor public policy, and a lack of love. Biblical and Social Justice, What Is It?, is a book of education, inspiration, and hope. It contains over 100 footnotes of references to reliable sources. Biblical and Social Justice, What Is It? Includes chapters such as What is Justice? Social Justice and Preparedness to Act, The Reign of Narratives, A Nation Founded on Christian Principles. That's a question. Dr. Martin Luther King's Concept of Justice, which is my exposition on the letter from the Birmingham jail. Blessings of Education and the Perils of Miseducation. In the words of John Wesley, this is from a 1774 publication that John Wesley released, in which he talked about the conditions of people in Africa and how they lived, which is far from savage, as we have been taught. There's also a chapter that deals with success stories, in which we look at 5 organizations who have practiced principles of social justice and righteousness in their communities. And the book closes with frequent statements and questions, and also there's a 9-page glossary of civil justice terms. I invite you to learn more about this important book and purchase your copy, and perhaps a copy for others. I believe a book like this will be a great gift to others and to your children. For those who like to purchase multiple copies of the book, there is a significant discount for doing so. Information is at the website. You can learn more about the book at www.biblicaljusticebook.com. And again, thank you for your interest. Remember, justice equals righteousness. And we're called to make a positive impact in both the community of believers in Christ, as well as the larger society in which we live and serve. So thank you for your interest. And please check out the book. God bless.